We can open this last session. Dear and respectable protagonists, participants and presentators of the conference concerning the project of Peter Eisenman. We are almost at the end of the conference. This is the last session titled Against Eisenman in already warm atmosphere. The introductory talk will be given by John McMorrough, and other presentation will be given by Kim Förster and with participation of Manuel Orazi, and obviously in presence of Mr. Peter Eisenman in audience. I didn't mention Mr. Manuel. I did Manuel Orazi, yes, okay. Biography, so all participants were already presented. Please, Mr. McMorrough, can you proceed?
Am I on?
Yes.
This is the panel of the damned. I will say this, and I'll explain that more in just a moment. Originally, Jeff Kipnis was scheduled to moderate this panel, and while I cannot match his status, I can somewhat approximate his stature, if nothing else. There we go again. So the topic of this panel is against Eisenman. And one of my disappointments of Jeff not being here, in addition to always being interested in what he has to say, is how he was going to formulate this possibility of against Eisenman. As you can tell by the sparse population of the panel, not many others know either how to address this possibility. That's what I mean, a sort of damned panel. I mean, on this question of against Eisenman, I think there are, of course, two answers, yes and no. I think in the short answer of yes, of course, it's possible to be against Eisenman, taking the title of the conference as our cue, issues. We could say it's the very earmark of a certain kind of generational litmus test to take issue with Eisenman. We've seen this again and again throughout the day. The procedure works as follows. I think there is the possibility for young theorists and designers of subsequent generations to find an appreciation of Peter's work, and then to find also some new nuance, some issues, some against, through which they can both establish their understanding of the previous generation's work, but also embark on their own. But in another way, I would say to be against Eisenman is a kind of condition of impossibility. And this I would attribute to what I was trying to articulate previously in terms of a kind of Eisenman effect. And I'd really like to spin this presentation not to forestall any critiques of Eisenman, but to try to situate this impossibility of againstness of Eisenman not as a person, but this overall Eisenman effect. And one of the reasons that I think this is possible, and this is where I've sort of retaken the title and recast it, is that to be against Eisenman is already internal to the very logic of the Eisenman effect itself. To be against is to be internal to Eisenman's own project. So I've recast against Eisenman to the against Eisenman, Eisenman against the world. And here I would want to posit a sort of fundamental strategy that I think you can see throughout his career and his production. Here we take the title of the journal from the Institute, Oppositions, but I think the very nature of an oppositional status, an againstness, is an earmark of Eisenman's production throughout. And so where in the previous discussion, I would want it to situate Eisenman's occupation of the classical roles of the architect, as designer, as theorist, as educator and builder. I think in the operation of his practice, it has continually operated within the privileged formats of those productions in a way both to elucidate and negate those very same formats. So to be against, we could say, receives logics of the formats of production. And so we could start with this sort of understanding of againstness in the early work, but I think with all of the examples, I think we could pick almost any point and trace it back to this sort of fundamental againstness within Eisenman's work. We could take, for example, his conception of writing and his role as a theorist. Here in the example of the Notes of a Conceptual Architecture towards the Definition, 1970, the notorious piece where he gives us the format of an academic essay, noting the positions of the references, the footnotes, which mark the page, with the absence of the text that would have occurred in its place. A kind of, at one level, a nod to a sort of conceptual art practice, but at another level, I think a more fundamental understanding of the operation of writing. And we've heard many times of the emphasis that Eisenman placed on the importance of an architect's books or his production as when he's remembered. But I think there's also, at the same level of the productivity of the writing that which Eisenman engages, there is a fundamental attitude towards the writing. Now, whether it's in something like this, which is so clearly diagrammatic of a sort of logic of absence, or in many of the texts where there's a kind of notorious difficulty of the writing to penetrate a kind of clear model of thesis and a sort of clarity of message to be drawn. I think this is actually a kind of textual strategy to prevent the possibility of a kind of facile reaction and open up, again, as we see in many cases, another kind of possibility. And I think these have ramifications in the architecture. We can take, for example, something like this, the Frank House, house number 4 of Cornwall, Connecticut from 1975, where the architecture again and again operates in a sort of againstness of perceived conceptions of meaning. And so here, another notorious example where the notational necessity of the void to elucidate the structure coincidentally occurs at the juncture of the marriage bed, bifurcating a sort of received notion of the meaning of that space into another condition of possibility. We can also see this againstness within Eisenman's conception of the act of drawing, or he would probably have us say diagram, where again we're removed from a kind of isomorphic conception of the delineated drawing to create one object. And this has been discussed, this is back in reference to the conversation that Peter and Greg were having in terms of different interpretations of this sort of work, whether it's a machinic process at which you could stop at any point or an active composition. But I think at the fundamental level of looking at the drawing as a format, it is always about a possibility of registering a multiplicity. And here, these are the famous diagrams of the early houses, but I think we could also look at, frankly, the sketches of that same period. And there's been those who've commented on those sketches in this sort of freehand doodling sense of elaboration and iteration. I believe Peter referenced the thousands of drawings he made for some of these early projects in the hand of the architect in very much that same mode, but with a kind of proliferation that obliterates the possibility of singularity, for lack of a better term. And I think we've seen already the Wexner Center a number of times. And again, this project could stand for many, where there is the possibility of reading out of the situation not one condition which holds the plenitude of thought, but a multiplicity of meanings, a multiplicity of registrations, of traces, of palimpsest, of indices. We've heard these terms throughout, and I think they're all means of measuring difference against the field of difference. The difference project, I would say. As well, and here another text that I think should be invoked. This is an image to stand in for a text. This is the infamous isomorphic model of House 10 from 1975. But the reference that I'd like to make is to his conception as a builder. I think most adamantly demonstrated in his early text, Cardboard Architecture, where he talks about seemingly a very fundamental condition of the architect as builder, that is to realize within the sort of firmitas, the sort of strong ability of the construction to withstand forces, material, constructional logics, and instead posited this notion of a cardboard architecture, of an architecture which would be understood first and foremost as an idea before a materialization, and as such would hold the logics of materialization at bay and try to build the house as if it were a model. And here we get into the anecdotes that populate this field of interpretation, where the very logic of the construction, that this model, this house, see it works already, this house is built as it were a model, and so even at the level of the joinery of the members, of the post to beam, which is the zone of so much thought of elaboration, of a sort of tectonics of present, instead get rendered as a edge-to-edge, almost a glued connection. And so, again, a negation of this canonical quality of building which would define the architect. Okay, this is the Serbian version of what was supposed to go here. There's a little error, but it works nonetheless, because it originally said image not found. And the image not found is to try to define this third category, which I have in reference to, I think, frankly, one of the most important texts of Peter, and strangely enough, it's a text that I think operates with absolute clarity, and it's the text Post-Functionalism, where he talks about really a core perceived knowledge about the operation of architecture, especially modern architecture, to operate as an elaboration of a possibility of use, an elaboration of program that becomes form. That's the very dictum of the form following function. And Peter, in this regard, wants to be against that very idea, to set up another condition. And the elaboration is not just about function per se, but it's, I would say, covers any number of sort of determinant, we could call them material or technical aspects of architecture, to be definitive of the architectural project. And here I think he follows a model, acknowledged or not, insignificant, of a much earlier text by somebody who has a name, Philip Johnson, and his 7 Crutches of Architecture, which perform, I think, a very similar operation of taking away, being against. In Eisenman's case, it's against function. In Johnson's case, it was against notions of history and plan, to really situate, I think, a great unknown, or rather a great possibility, but nonetheless an unknown, of what would constitute architecture as a medium unto itself. I think more properly within the language of the time, and that it's been deployed already in the conference, to have an autonomous logic of architecture, an autonomous logic that would not be able to be extrapolated out from the conditions of its existence. So not a logic of coming into being out of circumstance, but a logic that would already come from the internal thought of its concept, of its very nature. And here I show again the example of the Santiago de Compostela project, and this image again functioning for, I think, many other images, where the very notion of Eisenman's work is to again and again problematize the habitual conditions of use, so that you cannot simply move through the space as a distracted, as Benjamin would call it, a sort of distracted subject of the architecture, but must be drawn into a kind of thoughtful engagement with the very conditions of your occupation. So this againstness, this oppositional quality, I think, as I've said, has operated throughout Eisenman's work. And what I think is the surprising outcome of all of this againstness is a real condition of possibility. And the concept I would like to describe this possibility is the idea that comes out of philosophy of a possible world. And so there's the world that we live in. There's the world where circumstances have aligned in a particular fashion and give us who we are and what we are and how we operate. But then there's other possibilities, other turns not taken that could have been articulated. And I think, again and again, Eisenman operates outside of this condition of the actually possible to try to articulate another possible world, another possibility out of which we could understand architecture. One that's not commensurate with the worldly forces, but another possible world. And I think the achievement, and this is where I get back to not only the sort of qualities of Eisenman's work as a theorist, as a builder, but want to evoke a much larger conception of this Eisenman effect, is that I think he's done a very interesting procedure. And I would argue that by dint of his efforts, and this sounds more heroic than I mean it, but I mean this quite sincerely, that I think by dint of this Eisenman effect, we have now in today's world of architecture, we should say, the notion of architecture itself as a possible world. And by architecture here, I don't mean buildings, and I don't mean every architect, but I mean if you want to talk about a certain kind of conception of an architecture which is theoretical, which is meaningful, which is conceptual, I think the long shadow of Eisenman's effect has been to make architecture itself a possible world as opposed to a merely actual one. And this phenomena, or this transferal, reminds me of a story by the author Borges. And he writes in one of his short stories, I forget the title. Well, I can't pronounce the title, honestly. But the book is about some people who find an encyclopedia of a country that turns out does not exist. In that encyclopedia, there's described a world in which all of the fiction of this fictional country occurs. And so there's much discussion about who wrote this encyclopedia, how did they derive this fiction. And so the story is about this sort of investigation of an origin for this imaginary world. But the surprising turn at the end of the story is that the author of the story starts to find manifestations of this possible world in the world in which he lives. He finds a coin, he finds a book, he finds these other things. And I think that is the way in which Eisenman has, in his creation of this possible world, this possible world of architecture, has in its own way infused into our larger cultural sense. So out of this sort of fictional possibility, I think there is a kind of migration, a mysterious migration into actuality. So finally, to return to the question of the notion of against. And that is the question of, is it possible to be against the Eisenman effect? And I would say the answer is no. That is, to be against the Eisenman effect at this point, in a space like this, would be to be against the very conditions of possibility where an event like this occurs. And I don't mean in the sort of overdetermined sense that Peter's sitting right there and the conference is called Eisenman. I mean that the possible world of a conference like this and to talk about these ideas has been created by the very process that I've tried to describe. And to be against something, to have a true fundamental againstness against this wider phenomena would be, as I referenced at the beginning, to be against the very conditions of possibility for an engagement with the idea of architecture as, and you can insert autonomous, you can insert conceptual, you can insert theoretical. The possible world of architecture today, I think, exists in the wake of the Eisenman effect. In fact, the only impossible world that I can imagine for architecture and for this room would be the world in which Peter Eisenman does not exist. I, for me, think that would be the truly impossible world. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for this beautiful introductory talk. And now I will announce Panayotis Pangalis. I didn't mention him before because he disappeared and now he's with us and we need a wire, please.
It's okay? Yes. So, against Eisenman. It's not very easy. In this session, last but not least, I would like to conclude with a hope. The hope to see Peter Eisenman deconstructing his theories, since they are now considered classic. We are not sure if his target was to transform his architecture in a classic or classical vocabulary of the second half of the 20th century, or to create an atmosphere of reactions in front of the ghosts of modernism. So, does his architecture obtain elements from the classical thought, or does it contradict to it, and how? What is the real connection between Eisenman's work and the past? From the Renaissance onwards, the reading of the past is a subject that occupies all architects. In order to comprehend Eisenman's thought, we have to repeat once more the position of another architect, Piranesi, who, in my opinion, symbolizes the introduction to the contemporary era of architecture. Piranesi was interested in the past while he was indifferent to re-establishing the ruins. The invention and the freedom of imagination are, according to him, the elements that can disengage architecture for the STEM imitation of classical art. The collections of Piranesi's engravings were accompanied by texts in which the author presents his theoretical views. In his work entitled Prima parte di architetture e prospettive, so first part of architecture and perspectives, published in 1743, he stated that the era of the magnificent architecture of the Romans has long gone. Given the lack of wealthy commission agents, the architect has nothing else to do than to invent, to design, and reproduce his thoughts on engravings. It was one of the solutions for the survival of the architect. Against the imitation of an ideal type of beauty, Piranesi proposes the liberty of capriccio and the inexhaustible concept of invention. In this way, he expresses his criticism on rationalism, on the unified space, and on the role of the center. He advocates the dissolution of the form and the typological negation, as they are presented in his work entitled Il Campo Marzio dell'Antica Roma in 1762. In this critical view of Piranesi, it is more than obvious that the architectural object is unable to contribute to the reorganization of space. Therefore, the question is shifted from the morphological level to the reconstruction of the architecture vocabulary. Peter Eisenman reads in the work of Piranesi the creation of a theory of architecture that constitutes a self-referential system. Piranesi's proposals for Campo Marzio are for Eisenman examples of architecture that move away from the repeating of classical proposals, and instead he counterposes new principles initiated by a total clearance of the previous. Surely, in the mid-18th century, Piranesi believed that the architect may establish an architectural and political world for which will be the solely responsible. This, of course, was the beginning of yet another utopia. Thus, destruction and removal acquire special importance and displayed with particular emphasis. Piranesi's proposals, although based on partitioning and decompositioning of Roman architecture, do not cease to constitute new architectural versions. This is exactly the same methodology followed by Eisenman. Deconstruction was the reaction against the political and economical status quo, but along the way, it was absorbed by the system itself and became its major exponent. After the introduction of the theory of deconstruction in the educational body of architecture, it became a design style. And the more we build in this style, the more this theory self-destructs. Today, the largest and richest projects globally replicate the morphological principles of deconstruction. What was once revolutionary and innovative now is fashionable. And if we don't stop producing forms using this theory, the theory will soon become a pure spectacle, therefore a product for mass consumption. Finally, the following questions arise. On a system of hard economical contrasts, is the constant change the only possibility of survival? Did this continual modification of the form lead to a geometrical nihilism where geometry simply self-confirms its presence in the social being and this of the architect too? If deconstruction is a procedure based on the privative prefix D, it indicates that before the appearing of the D, a construction existed. So the term deconstruction itself demonstrates that it is a combination of something old with something new, something past with something present. But in our days, we know well that deconstruction is not a new theory. It was an invention and now is part of the past too. It has become a method, therefore it has become another construction opposed to what Derrida suggested. The main problem, if we want to be consistent with the deconstruction principles, is to reply to the following question. How could we deconstruct these multiple deconstructions? The double D before the term construction gives us an answer, since the negation of the negation means affirmation. We must eliminate the prefix D, leaving bare the construction far away from the architecture. Architecture could retrieve its negations and turn back to the theory. Today, we need to talk more about architecture, not to construct anymore. So I believe that a different title of this final session would be Eisenman against Eisenman. Now we reached to the point of asking him about the future of the present. What do I mean by future of the present? After 40 years of deconstruction, we have to understand if the works of Peter Eisenman acquired new meanings, if these meanings affect our perceptions of life, and most of all, if this life must be altered even more or not. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this is loud. Don't expect too much from this presentation. It's only three images, and I have to say I can only pick up what has been said before and elaborate on it. For me, it's also an unease to sit here on this panel against Eisenman. I think it's not a personal question. I'm not against Peter Eisenman, I mean, I have to say I have to approach this question of against Eisenman also in a historical manner, as I've done before. I've no interest in taking sides, and I'm still taking on the responsibility for critical practice as a historian here. So I have a few remarks towards both the title of the session and then also this project of opposition. First of all, the title against Eisenman is... The title against Eisenman reminds me a lot of this one essay called Against Theory, which was published in Critical Inquiry in 1982, that year that Eisenman stepped back as director of the Institute. And in this essay, Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels, two professors of literature, tried to show that the whole enterprise of a critical theory was misguided and should have been abandoned. So instead they called for a new pragmatism in literary studies. And what puzzles me is not this equation of Eisenman with theory here. I'm not sure whether it was intentional or not, and it doesn't really matter because Peter Eisenman's work and career has always been identified with this project of theory. We've heard about his dissertation on former readings or some of the masterworks. We also saw this first page of the Notes of Conceptual Architecture published in the thematic issue on Conceptual Architecture and Design Quarterly in 1970, consisting only of footnotes. We've also heard about the formalist readings of Tirani's rationalist architecture, and I talked about the Institute being considered as a think tank. So what irritates me a bit is if after theory is here the reference, that rather we are challenged as panelists here how to react to it, and I'm not sure whether the audience is challenged also. The second remark I have to make is with regard to this project of opposition. In a historical perspective, I can only offer a brief overview of forming opposition as a rhetorical and also strategic move exercised by the Institute. Of course, there's always been a story of Peter Eisenman and his enemies, and to my mind, there was a certain logic behind it. So I would like to look at 3 examples where camps were designed, different camps where a debate was sparked. These short remarks cannot substitute an analysis of the architectural debate of those years of the 70s and afterwards, of different formats which applied this strategy of opposition. Also, I think that there's different levels we have to address here. One is a social level. So Peter Eisenman spoke about the mentorships of Rowe, Tafuri, Derrida, and also mentioned that apparently all of them were rather conflictual relationships. I would be curious to find out to what extent they were actually productive. The other level is the discursive level. To my reading of the Institute's history, it was designed and also made use of various mechanisms and media of staging conflict and process for a productive end. So you didn't show the last page of the Notes for Conceptual Architecture article. For me, it's really telling because there in the biography, we dealt with a lot of biographies today, but in the biography of Peter Eisenman, it was referred to the Institute. And for me, it's really important to have this link that the theoretical project was from the very beginning linked to the Institute. But this shows that there was a certain discursive move also being involved. So the 3 examples I brought, I already mentioned them beforehand. The first example is the special issue of Casabella guest edited by the Institute in 1971. Which did not produce a common approach towards architecture and urban studies as you could actually expect from an institution, but rather documented the various theoretical and historiographical positions of the Institute's fellows, which would henceforth shape both American and international debates. This issue, which appeared in a bilingual edition for the first time, consisted of 3 parts. The first is a discussion, one exemplary of contemporary architectural debates of populism and elitism between Denise Scott Brown and Kenneth Frampton. The second part then consists of various articles by young American architectural theoreticians and historians who argue for a new conceptualism on the one hand side and a new contextualism on the urban side. And this issue also contains, among others, the second version of Peter Eisenman's Notes on Conceptual Architecture, whose argumentation here draws on Noam Chomsky's structural linguistics and equates conceptual architecture and abstract art. The third part then encompasses 3 texts by Emilio Ambas, of whom we've heard beforehand, on this so-called Universitas project, a proposal for a new design academy for post-industrial society, which was then subject to a debate at the MoMA in the early 1972. An important aspect about the Casabella issue, next to this self-presentation of the Institute, which I referred to earlier, for the first time to an European audience, was that here the Institute developed the editorial strategy of juxtaposing contradictory positions for the first time, an approach that then would be perfected later with oppositions. The second example, which we've also heard about beforehand, is this publication of the book Five Architects in 1972, a prime example to my reading of how a publication was conceived to stir attention and eventually turned into a media event. Taking shape in the course of the publication, Five Architects was then a polemic between two camps. On the one hand, the whites around Peter Eisenman, and on the other hand, the grays, with the publication of a response by Five Architects, which formed around Robert Stern, published in Architectural Forum, and staged by the editor Susan Stevens, as well as then a follow-up article, a review in the New York Times by Paul Goldberger, the young architectural critic then, who actually coined the term New York Five in this article. So what we have here is a rhetorical confrontation between an apparently radical and a formalist stance on the one hand, and a populist and historicist argument on the other hand. And this opposition then characterized architectural debates in the US up until the mid-1970s. Peter Eisenman referred to the breakup of the New York Five already starting in '73, but in the end both camps were unified and went hand in hand, at least with the Venice Biennial in '76. What interests me here is the central role that those strategies of advertisement and marketing, of public relations, played in architectural debates. The third and last example I would like to briefly mention is oppositions. We saw this image of the model of the first cover, which then turned orange. Launched at the Institute in November 1973 as so the subtitle, A Journal for Ideas and Criticism in Architecture. The first regular publication after several attempts were made to start an independent review. For my mind, the title is already telling, and there's this wordplay with a left out first P, as you can see. The editors, next to Peter Eisenman, also Kenneth Frampton and Mario Granatzonas, who were then later joined by Anthony Wittler and Kurt Förster, were quite aware, as the editorials state, that as with any publishing and hence economic activity, they were operating with knowledge and power. Oppositions offered the editors an opportunity to define themes on an international level through their selection of authors and translated text, and beyond that to claim interpretive authority through their own contributions. In programmatic editorials, they established the oppositional logic of a polemic, which must be understood less dialectical than rhetorical to my reading. And post-functionalism, the editorial to Opposition 6, is one of those editorials where Peter Eisenman laid the groundwork maybe for the later approaches of a deconstructivist architecture. As a powerful instrument of self-valorization and self-display, the journal not only served the management, that is to say the administration and control of information, but also to disseminate the narrative of the Institute as a think tank. So those strategies, the discursive strategies which were prominent in oppositions were also applied in the other publications, and I only brought this overview of different publications in print formats, which were the sponsoring of recognized positions. We've heard about the Italians, especially Aldo Rossi, being featured on the pages of oppositions, and also the incorporation of criticism, which I think is a strong and smart strategic move. Also, the reinterpretation of different positions by authors, which were then featuring large in the editorials, the introductions to the book series. So to conclude, all those strategies of an opposition, to my reading, led to a valuation of the discipline and the profession. And to that extent, we maybe want to discuss to what extent it was productive.